Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii's program, which is called How Did We Get Here? I am the host of this program. I'm DeSoto Brown. I'm the Bishop Museum historian and the curator for the archives here at Bishop Museum in Honolulu. And today on this program, which is about stories from Hawaiian history, I'm going to be showing you pictures of and describing grand mansions that used to exist in Honolulu. This is called Lost Grandeur, the demolished mansions or the destroyed mansions of Honolulu. And most people don't even know that these great homes once even existed at all because there's no trace of many of them. And there are more than the ones I'm showing you today. And I plan to be doing more programs like this in the future. So, what's my point in showing you these pictures and telling you this? I want to get across to you that things change not only in cities, but also economically, socially, and in many other ways. Families are people who are on top with wealth and power, sometimes go away almost entirely. And the evidence of the power that they used to have in the form of their former homes also goes away. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So we're beginning with this picture, which is of a home that used to stand on the slopes of Punch Bowl. And as with many other similar mansions, it had a name. And this house was called the Towers because, as you can see, there are two towers that it contains. This house was built by and occupied by a man named Frederick J. Laurie. He became wealthy by being the head of Lewis and Cook, which was the major building supply company in the Hawaiian Islands throughout, say, the first half of the 20th century. And in addition to the big building downtown where his office was, this was his home for his family. He was married and he had four children, one of whom died when she was a teenager, leaving his three sons. And today, obviously, there's no sign of this home anymore, but I can tell you it was located at the corner of Lunalilo Street and Victoria Street. And that probably won't sound very familiar, but if you frequently drive on the H1 freeway and you're going towards downtown, you will be familiar with the Vineyard Boulevard off-ramp. Well, at the top of the retaining wall that's next to that off-ramp is Lunalilo Street, and that's where this home used to stand. And this was part of an entire neighborhood of large homes, which was located there because Punch Bowl was close to downtown Honolulu, where the men would have worked. And it was easy to commute just down the hill to get to your job. Inside this home was pretty amazing too. This is what you would have seen if you had walked in from the front door, which was on the wall that we're looking towards, I believe. Yeah, that's right. And are in the middle of these four pillars, which are sort of roped off with mylae, which would normally we expect to see that as a lei, but we also see that sometimes as a something that's used for the grand opening of a building, for example. We have a mylae lei you untie. Well, there also are these large vases, there are potted plants, there are these carved wooden stands. They're all standing on a tiled section. And in the middle of this tiled section, it's not easy to see, there's an actual fountain. There's a shallow fountain. So this was something that was inside this home. If you look at the ceiling right here, there's an open space that is leading up to the second floor. So on the second floor of the home, you could stand at a railing and look down into the first floor and see this feature, which is pretty darn amazing. Well, what happened to this house? Frederick Laurie had another house, which I'm just about to describe to you, and he seems to have moved out of this house, the Towers, by the early 1940s, and it was being used by a church. And in the 1950s and 60s, the house transitioned to being the headquarters of something that was called the Easter Seals, which was a nonprofit group that was formed to combat tuberculosis, which was a very prevalent disease in all over the world at that time, which has pretty much been under control now for a long time because of antibiotics. And in 1967, this house was demolished. Before that happened, In the early 60s, on the grounds that had been the Laurie property, one condominium was built called the Townhouse. And then after this house was demolished, another one was built called the Surf View. So today, this is just the location of two condos, one of among the many that are located on the slopes of Punch Bowl. The other house that Frederick J. Laurie owned was in Nuuanu, and it was called Niniko. And this is a photo of Niniko in 1941. This house was originally considered to be sort of a country house to get away from the heat of Honolulu and live in Nuuanu Valley where it was cooler. And in addition to this house, as is true of many of the mansions, there were very extensive landscaped grounds around the house. And in this photograph, not only do you see some of the gardens, if you look to the left, going up to the other side of Nuuanu Valley, the property extended up partly to that area as well. And within this landscaped garden, there were various features like the what you see right here. This is next to the house. And you can see on the left, there's a small sort of pergola structure. Although you won't be able to read it, there is a sign posted on that little structure that says visitors welcome. So I don't know how often the gardens were open to the public, but apparently they were. In 1948, Frederick Laurie died, and his three sons sold the property to be subdivided. So all of these gardens were demolished, were bulldozed, turned into subdivision. The property also extended through where now the Poly Highway goes, which is down to the left in this photograph. And amazingly, the house is still standing. And you can see it if you drive up a street, a small dead end street to get to it. But of course, it's entirely surrounded by other houses, and all the grounds are covered by houses now. Next on our list of grand mansions is this one. And this aerial photograph, you may be able to recognize that we're looking at the base of Diamond Head with the ocean in the background on the right. And down at the bottom of this image is our next home, which is called Lapatra. And it was constructed by Walter Dillingham and his wife, Louise Dillingham. And it too was a grand mansion. And here's a photo of Lapatra with Diamond Head in the background. And this is the driveway that led up to the house. And of course, there was a main house, but there were a variety of other houses and other structures. There was a separate garage, and there was a separate guest house, and lots of other stuff like that. Walter Dillingham was the descendant of a man who had come here in the middle 1800s, and the family had become extremely wealthy through a variety of business interests. And Walter Dillingham was an extremely powerful man at this time, not only because of his money and because of the business dealings that he had, but also because of his political influence and his closeness to, for example, the US military as well. So when Walter and his wife Louise decided they needed a grand home, Mrs. Dillingham had come from Chicago. So she chose an architectural firm in Chicago to design and oversee the construction of the house. So that's in Chicago. This is out here in Honolulu. And this was going on from 1919 to 1921. And during that time period, there was no internet. And it was not possible even to make long distance phone calls between Honolulu and Chicago. So that meant that during this construction process, and a lot of that time, Walter Dillingham was in Washington, D.C., serving as a business lobbyist. So there's correspondence in abundance between Walter Dillingham, who's trying to oversee the costs, Louise Dillingham, his wife, and the architectural company in Chicago. And there were not only letters, but a lot of telegrams. And Mrs. Dillingham was corresponding with the architects over things like a particular wooden door had been painted the wrong color. I mean, it's just unbelievable to think of what the process was. When you approached the house, you came to this courtyard, and the front door to the mansion was located on the left, and you can see it there. La Pietra was the name of a villa in Italy where Walter and Louise Dillingham had been married, I believe in 1912. And so they gave the same name to this home. This house was not literally an exact copy of that Italian villa, but it did incorporate various elements from the original structure. And basically, it was, again, this is sort of a fantasy built in the United States of what an Italian villa from several hundred years earlier would have looked like. And here's another view of the main house. And this is obviously a very classical looking structure, the symmetry, the detailing on it. It is a very beautiful house. And of course, it was surrounded by extensive grounds. And because it was located on the slopes of Diamond Head, there were various terraces for various levels that were necessary to be built. And this lawn that we are looking at the house from was sometimes used for large entertaining, large parties. The Dillinghams, as wealthy people, were constantly hosting guests who were visiting from different places. They were having parties for important visitors. They were they were doing business in addition to being sociable with other important folks. And that's the way it was and the way it still is, although the people involved today are no longer the ones who were doing it back then. And here's a view of the house from the tennis court, which was on the level above this. And in addition to a tennis court and all of these open lawns and trees, there was also a swimming pool. Swimming pools were not common at the time this house was built because all of the equipment that we are accustomed to today to filter and circulate the water, that didn't exist yet. So you pretty much filled the pool, had water in it, and eventually drained it and refilled it again once it got kind of dirty. What happened to the house? Well, Walter and Louise Dillingham had four children, one of whom was killed in World War II. And by the time they died in the early 1960s, their children, the remaining children, were, of course, married adults who lived elsewhere. And the Dillingham children were remarkably unsentimental about their childhood home. And the house was supposed to be demolished and the grounds developed. Part of the grounds were developed into a group of townhouses, but at the last minute, a group stepped in to save the house and turn it into a girls' school, which is what it still is today. This was originally in the 1960s called Hawaii School for Girls, but in more recent years, they changed the name back to La Pietra, the original name of the home. And finally, here's an even more astonishing mansion. This house is called Kainalu, which means ocean wave. And again, we're right at the base of Diamond Head. In this picture, you can see Diamond Head in the background. And we're right on the shoreline. In fact, part of the house extends out over the shoreline to be over the water. And this house was constructed by a man named James Bicknell Castle and his wife, who's named Julia. And the Castle family was descended from missionaries, Protestant missionaries, who had come to the Hawaiian Islands in the 1820s or the 1830s. And you may have heard the cynical expression that the missionaries came to Hawaii to do good, but did well, meaning they came to do good things to spread Christianity by what their standards were. But some of them became very wealthy and did well after they stopped being missionaries and they and their descendants became business people. And that's what happened with the castles. This huge, huge house has three full floors, as you can see if you look at it from this angle. It's then got an attic on top, which is another floor. And on the very top, on the roof, there's a viewing platform that's got a railing around it, and it's got a striped canvas awning over it. So you could be up five stories high, which in 1901, when this house was finished, was amazing. And you could look all around and look at Waikiki, which at that time was completely undeveloped compared to today, except that the Moana Hotel was also built further down the coast in 1901, not unlike this building, a gigantic wooden structure with a lot of detailing on it. Now, the amazing thing about this house is that there were only three people in the Castle family. There was James Castle, the father, there was Julia, the mother, and their son, Harold. And that's all. Other family members did come and live in the house, and people, of course, did come and stay and visit. But still, this immense house for just three people. And this view also reminds us that not only were these houses occupied by the people who lived in them, who built them, but they had to have a whole group of employees as well. So there were people who lived inside the house, took care of the inside of the house, cooked the food for the house, cleaned the house. And there was a lot of cleaning, obviously, that you had to do at a house this big. But then they also had to employ a bunch of people to take care of the grounds because all of that grass had to be mowed and the lawnmowers, there weren't any mechanized lawnmowers. You pushed a mechanical lawnmower across all that grass. You had to water all that grass with sprinklers because there weren't any underground built-in sprinklers yet. And you had every day somebody had to rake up all the leaves. So there was a lot to do for a house this big. And here is the stairway of Kainalu. And as you can see, if you look more carefully, if you're able to see with the detailing, all of the balustrade, all of the railing of this stairway has got individual hand painted detailing on the wood, in addition to the detailing that's on the ceiling. And we're looking towards stained glass windows. Now, another amazing thing about this house, there was only one bathroom in the entire thing. And the bathroom was located, I believe, on just off of um, the landing that we see that we're looking at the level below this in the stairway. So it was located part way between the first and second floors, so you could access it from the whole house by going to the main stairway. How do I know there was only one bathroom? Well, because one of James and Julia Castle's granddaughters lived in this house as a child. She was the daughter of Harold Castle, and she had a brother and sister. And she told me when she was an elderly lady that there was only one bathroom. She lived there, she would know. Here's another view of the stairway that I just showed you. But this picture was taken in the middle 1930s, and there's something kind of odd on the stairway. That is, there's a full-size taxidermied elk. Why is there an elk, a dead elk, on the stairway? Well, because the Castles only lived in this house for 20 years, from 1900 to 1920. And in that year, they sold it to the Elks Club, the Elks fraternal organization, and the Elks turned it into the Elks Club, where they had meals, where they had gatherings, where they had meetings, but they also used the rooms of the house for members of the Elks, who are it's a obviously a men only club, could also live. They could rent rooms in the structure. Here is either the living room or the ballroom, perhaps, of Kainalu when it was still owned by the Castles. In 1901 is when this picture was taken. And look at this huge room. And again, all of the ceiling details, hand painted, there's gold paint on the sides and the tops of the columns that are in this room. Highly polished floor, but not a lot of furniture. And I was told that the house was so big and that there weren't many people in it, that a lot of it never really got furnished. So this room may have stayed big and open and wide like this for the whole time that the Castles lived there. So going from this view when it was a private home in 1901 to this view of the same room in the middle 1930s, once it had become the Elks Club, and now it's got furniture in it. But in the time period between when the house was built and when this picture was taken, a lot of things had changed in terms of what popular things were being done architecturally, what things were being done for home interiors. And by this time, the interior of this house looked really outdated. It looked really old fashioned. Nobody was building houses to look like this anymore. And if you look carefully, you can see that the furniture, which is all rattan, which is a type of palm that is used for making furniture in the Philippines, which is where all this furniture came from. This was popular then, and this is very different in style from the ornate Victorian material that was originally in the house when it was owned by the castles. Now, a closer view of the stairway and a cluster of stained glass windows on that same landing. The windows around the outside of this group are possibly factory made. These may not have been custom made. These may have been available from a supplier, but in the center is a custom made stained glass window from the Tiffany Company. Now, today we know Tiffany as a seller primarily of high end jewelry. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when it started, it was known for making stained glass. And not only did they make windows like this, but they made lamps with stained glass shades. And they also made vases and other glass objects. And they were famous for creating a new and different finishes and colors for colored glass. Well, Tiffany windows were expensive even then, and they were custom made, as you can see here. And this has an undersea theme of a mermaid kind of riding on a seahorse, but the seahorse is like the size of the mermaid. Seahorses in reality are very little. In 1959, the Elks decided to demolish this huge mansion, and they had an auction of all of the contents, all of the interior stuff. And this stained glass window was purchased by the Spencecliffe Corporation, which ran a chain of restaurants here in Hawaii, almost all of them on Oahu. And one of the Spencecliffe restaurants was this one. This is Fisherman's Wharf, which was located next to Kewalo Basin. And the first floor and the second floor of this restaurant were considered to be different dining rooms or almost different restaurants, if you will. And for the second floor, that was called the Captain's Bridge, and it also contained the Mermaid Bar. Well, the Mermaid Bar, as you can see, was named after the stained glass window from Kainalu, which had been bought and installed in the Fisherman's Wharf building. And this is a color image of what that stained glass window would have looked like. Well, Fisherman's Wharf is long gone, just as Kainalu itself is long gone. I have no idea what happened to this window, but if it still exists, it is worth a tremendous amount of money because those early Tiffany pieces are very unique and very specialized, and they're very expensive. So, what is there today where Kainalu, the grand home, used to be? Well, it's still the Elks Club, and part of the property is leased by the Outrigger Canoe Club, but there's no trace of Kainalu. And this is the building that was constructed by the Elks in the 1950s, or about 1960, I should say, to replace Kainalu. And it's utilitarian, it's concrete, it's easy to take care of, and it has absolutely nothing to do with all of the magnificence that used to be there when there was the private home. And again, as I said earlier, most people have no idea that these homes even existed, that they ever were around. The detailing and the handcrafting that existed in these buildings could never be replicated today. It is a shame that almost all of them are gone, but it's an economic reality. As I've said to you, the people who lived in these houses lived there in some cases for only a few decades before the house got turned into something else like a church or a school or some other kind of business. And then eventually they get demolished because the upkeep is too expensive. So, also, as I said at the beginning, keep in mind the people who are on top today will not necessarily be on top tomorrow. The businesses that are on top today, the industries that are on top today, they're going to go away. And with them will go the physical evidence of what they also used to show off, contain. These were buildings to show off wealth. The wealth went away, the families went away, and the buildings went away. Thank you for joining me, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed this look back at buildings that we'll never see the likes of again. Lost Grandeur, I called it. I'm going to be doing more of these types of programs in the future. I hope to see you again here on ThinkTech for my future episodes of How Did We Get Here? I'm DeSoto Brown. Thanks for being with me, and I hope to see you again in the future. Until then, aloha.